July 1976. A house in San Clemente, California, 2 years after the resignation. Pat Nixon is sitting alone with a book. It's a fresh copy of The Final Days, the second book by the two reporters who ended her husband's presidency, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. She hasn't wanted to read it. Her daughters have begged her not to, but she reads it anyway, alone, in a house that used to be surrounded by Secret Service and is now mostly just quiet. Somewhere in those pages, something breaks. Within days, Pat Nixon suffers a massive stroke. The left side of her body goes numb. For a period of time, she cannot speak at all. The woman reporters once called the most disciplined public performer in American politics, unable to form a sentence. She recovers most of her movement. She never fully recovers her voice in public life. She gives almost no more interviews for the rest of her 17 remaining years. Here is the strange part. Pat Nixon was married to Richard Nixon for 53 years. Longer than almost any first lady in American history stayed married to her president. Photographs from their wedding day, from Navy years apart during the war, from the White House lawn, all show two people who appear devoted. Her husband wrote her love letters from the Pacific that historians still quote as some of the tenderest correspondence of any 20th century president. And yet the people closest to that marriage, her own household staff, biographers who spent years with both of them, describe something else entirely underneath it. A marriage that was, in the words of people who lived alongside it, largely silent by the end. Two people occupying the same rooms, the same stages, the same 53 years, without much left to say to each other in private. This is the story of how a farm girl from Nevada, who buried both parents before she turned 18, ended up as one of the most photographed women on earth, standing next to a man the whole country was watching, while almost nobody was watching her. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who finds these hidden lives of political marriages fascinating, subscribe now, because we cover a new one every week, and Pat Nixon's story is one of the harder ones to watch unfold. Chapter 1. A childhood with no room for softness. She wasn't born Pat. She was born Thelma Catherine Ryan on March 16, 1912, in a mining town called Ely, Nevada, in a house with no running water and no electricity. Her father, William Ryan, came home from the mines past midnight the night she arrived, and, because it was the eve of St. Patrick's Day, he started calling his daughter his St. Patrick's Babe in the Morn. The nickname stuck for the rest of her life. Almost nobody who knew her as an adult ever called her Thelma. The family didn't stay in Nevada long. William Ryan moved them to a small truck farm in Artesia, California, hoping the soil would treat them better than the mines had. It mostly didn't. Money was thin for the whole of Pat's childhood. She grew up doing farm chores before school and after school, and there wasn't much time left over for being a child. Her mother, Kate, died of cancer when Pat was 13. That's an age where most girls are still being looked after. Pat instead took over the household, cooking, cleaning, raising her two younger brothers, while still going to school. A few years later, her father developed a severe case of tuberculosis, and it crippled him. Pat took a job as a janitor and bookkeeper to help pay his medical bills, on top of the schoolwork, on top of running the house. She was 17 when he died too. By 18, she had buried both of her parents. Most people who go through something like that at that age come out of it one of two ways. They come out fragile, or they come out closed off, running on pure discipline, because discipline is the only thing that never abandoned them. Pat Ryan came out the second way. Friends and biographers who studied her later in life kept landing on the same word for her: composed. Not cold, not distant exactly, but composed in a way that looked almost engineered. She had built it herself, brick by brick, starting at 13. She put herself through Fullerton Junior College and then the University of Southern California, working as a pharmacy manager, a typist, an X-ray technician, and briefly as an extra in Hollywood movies. You can spot her, if you look hard enough, in a handful of 1930s films where she has no lines and no credit. She graduated cum laude from USC in 1937 and took a job teaching typing and shorthand at Whittier Union High School. She was 25 years old. She had no family left, no debts to anyone, and a self-sufficiency that would define the rest of her life, for better and, eventually, for a lot worse. Chapter 2. The Lawyer Who Wouldn't Take No. In January of 1938, Pat Ryan showed up to an audition for a community theatre production in Whittier called The Dark Tower. She wasn't trying to become an actress. It was a way to meet people in a small town where she had no roots. Sitting across from her at that same audition was a young lawyer named Richard Nixon, recently back from Duke Law School, trying to build a practice in a town where nobody particularly needed another lawyer. By Nixon's own account, he fell for her that night, hard and fast and completely. He reportedly told a friend he was going to marry her before he'd even had a real conversation with her. Pat did not feel the same urgency. Nixon asked her out. She said no. He asked again. She said no again. According to one account she later gave, she genuinely thought there was something a little nuts about how fast and how sure he was. But Nixon didn't let up, and eventually she agreed to one date, and then another. What eventually won her over wasn't romance in the conventional sense. It was his work ethic. She watched him build his law practice from almost nothing, watched him grind through cases most lawyers in town wouldn't bother with, and she recognized something of her own upbringing in it, the refusal to be beaten by circumstance. He courted her for 2 years. He even took up ice skating because it was something she and her friends did together, and by most accounts he was terrible at it, falling and bruising himself repeatedly just to have an excuse to be near her. They married on June 21st, 1940, in a small ceremony at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California. She was 28, he was 27. 2 years later, Nixon received a commission in the United States Navy and was shipped out to the Pacific Theater. For 14 months, the only contact the newlyweds had was letters. Nixon later wrote in his memoirs that mail from Pat was the only thing we really had to look forward to, and he wrote to her nearly every single day he was gone. One letter, sent on Thanksgiving in 1943, told her he'd been thinking about their years together and loving her every minute of it. If you only read those wartime letters, you'd assume you were looking at one of the great romances of the era. In a lot of ways, at that point, you would have been right. The strain hadn't started yet. The version of Richard Nixon in those letters is a homesick young officer who wants nothing more than to get back to his wife. The country hadn't gotten its hands on him yet. That was about to change. Chapter 3. Campaigns Turn a Marriage into a Job. Nixon came home from the war and, almost immediately, decided to run for Congress. Pat was not thrilled about it. She had married a lawyer, not a candidate, and politics was not a life she'd signed up for. But she campaigned at his side anyway, in 1946, going door to door, working phone banks, standing on stages next to a man who was suddenly a public figure and not just her husband. It worked. Nixon won the seat. Then, within 6 years, he won a Senate race, and then found himself picked as Dwight Eisenhower's running mate in 1952, at only 39 years old. That same year gave the marriage its first real test in public. Reports surfaced that Nixon had a secret fund from wealthy donors, and Eisenhower's campaign came under pressure to drop him from the ticket. Nixon considered resigning. It was Pat, according to his own later account, who talked him out of quitting, telling him that if he didn't fight back and instead crawled away, it would destroy him. He didn't crawl away. He went on national television instead, in what became known as the Checkers speech, and saved his spot on the ticket. The public saw a united political team that night. What the public didn't see was a wife who had wanted out of this world entirely and instead found herself locked further into it, with a husband whose career now consistently came first. By the time Nixon became vice president in 1953, Pat had settled into a role that would define the rest of her life. The smiling, composed political wife, standing a half step behind her husband, at every rally, every ribbon cutting, every overseas trip. She was good at it. She had a natural talent for small talk and warmth with strangers that Nixon, by nearly every account, simply did not have. Voters liked her more easily than they liked him, and she used that skill constantly because it was expected of her, while whatever she actually wanted for her own life, kept getting pushed further down the list. She was named Outstanding Homemaker of the Year in 1953, Mother of the Year in 1955, the Nation's Ideal Wife by a homemakers group in 1957. These sound like honors. In practice, they were a cage built out of compliments, a set of expectations about exactly what kind of woman Pat Nixon was allowed to be in public, with very little room left over for who she actually was. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did researching it, that's exactly the kind of story we go looking for on this channel, the parts of famous marriages that never made it into the official portrait. Hit subscribe now so the next one lands in your feed, and drop a comment telling me which First Lady you want us to cover next. We read every one of them. Chapter 4. The Night She Cried in Front of the Country. In 1960, Nixon ran for president against John F. Kennedy and lost in one of the closest elections in American history. Pat had reportedly told friends privately that she didn't want him to run at all. She didn't fight him publicly on it, but she made her feelings known within the family. On the night of the concession, cameras caught something rare. Pat Nixon, live on television, struggling to hold back tears as her husband conceded the race. Friends who knew her said this was the only time, before or after, that they ever saw her cry in public. For a woman who had spent her whole adult life performing composure on command, that one unguarded moment says more about what the previous 8 years had cost her than almost anything she ever said in an interview. 2 years after that, Nixon ran for governor of California and lost that race too, delivering his infamous line to reporters that they wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore. It looked, at the time, like the end of his political career. For Pat, it might have felt like relief. A private citizen's life, finally, after more than a decade of campaigns. It didn't last. By 1968, Nixon was running for president again, and Pat was back on the trail beside him. When he won, she became First Lady of the United States, and moved into a house where privacy would now be almost mathematically impossible. Asked once what she had given up by moving into the White House, she didn't dress the answer up. She just said, "My privacy." Asked what she missed most about her old life, she gave the exact same 2-word answer again. Chapter 5. Plastic Pat and the Woman Nobody Saw. As First Lady, Pat Nixon worked harder than almost any of her predecessors. She traveled to nearly 80 countries, more than any First Lady before her, often standing in for her husband as his personal representative on trips he couldn't make himself. She flew relief supplies to earthquake victims in Peru. She toured Africa and South America with real diplomatic standing, not just as decoration on a foreign trip. She expanded access to the White House for deaf visitors, blind visitors, people with limited mobility, foreign language speakers, groups that had essentially never been accommodated in the building's history. She personally acquired more than 600 pieces of art and antique furniture for the White House collection, continuing the restoration work Jacqueline Kennedy had started years earlier. None of that generated much press. What generated press was her face, because Pat had spent decades training herself to stay composed no matter what was happening around her. Reporters started calling her Plastic Pat, the implication being that the warmth was fake, that underneath the smile there was nothing real at all. It was, by nearly every account from people who actually worked with her, the opposite of true. She was doing exactly what her life had trained her to do since she was 13 years old. Hold the line, keep functioning, don't let anyone see the cracks. The country mistook a survival skill for a personality defect. Inside the White House, the isolation was getting worse, not better. Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, along with advisor John Ehrlichman, had built a tight wall around the president, cutting out most of his old advisors, and, according to people who worked in that West Wing, cutting out Pat and their daughters along with them. Pat reportedly never trusted Haldeman. She had, by multiple accounts, sharper instincts than her husband for reading which staffers were operating in good faith and which ones were just accumulating power around him. It didn't matter. Haldeman controlled the schedule, and Haldeman routinely left her out of presidential trips and decisions that, in earlier administrations, a First Lady would have simply been included in as a matter of course. She was, by 1972, one of the most admired women in the world, appearing on Gallup's list of most admired people 14 separate times across her public life. She was, at the exact same time, increasingly shut out of her own husband's inner circle, inside her own house. Chapter 6. Finding out like everyone else. In June of 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee's offices at the Watergate complex. It barely made news at first. Nixon denied any connection to it, and Pat believed him, the same way most of the country did. As the investigation crept closer to the Oval Office over the following 2 years, Nixon became more withdrawn, more isolated even from his own family, spending long stretches alone. Pat found out what her husband had actually known, and when, largely the same way the rest of America did, from newspapers, from television, from the same Woodward and Bernstein reporting everyone else was reading. She was the president's wife of 34 years, and on the single defining scandal of his life, she was informed after the fact, in public, alongside strangers. She never turned on him publicly. Through the worst of it, she kept giving the same answer whenever reporters pushed her, that she loved her husband, believed in him, and was proud of what he'd accomplished. She later told one of her daughters, in private, that Watergate was the only crisis in her entire life that had ever truly gotten her down. Given everything that life had already included, 2 dead parents by 18, a childhood of manual labor, decades of campaigns, that's not a small thing to say. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon stood in the East Room and announced his resignation. Pat stood beside him through the speech, then walked with him onto the White House lawn, where he turned back for one final wave before boarding the helicopter that would carry him away from the presidency for good. In the photograph everyone remembers from that morning, Nixon's arm is raised in his familiar double victory sign. If you look at Pat instead of him, her face reads like someone attending a funeral, because in a way, she was. Chapter 7. The silence that followed. They retreated to San Clemente, California, and largely disappeared from public life. Nixon spent much of the following years working to rebuild his historical reputation, writing books, giving interviews, slowly clawing his way back toward relevance. Pat played almost no visible role in any of that effort. The woman who had spent 30 years as the public face beside him simply stopped appearing. Then came the stroke in 1976, triggered, as the story goes, by reading The Final Days alone in that California house. She regained most of her physical function through therapy, but she never really returned to public life afterward. And the weakness from that stroke stayed with her for the rest of her days. A second stroke followed in 1983. It was during these post-presidency years that the fuller picture of the marriage started leaking out, mostly through people who had worked closely with the family. Reports from those close to the household described a marriage that had, for a long stretch of years, become sexless and, by some accounts, largely without warmth. 2 people sharing a house, a history, and a public image, without much private connection left underneath it. It's worth being careful here, because none of this came from Pat herself. She almost never discussed her marriage on the record, before or after the presidency, which is itself part of the story. She had spent her entire adult life keeping the private version of herself completely separate from the public one, and she kept that habit until the end. In 1979, the Nixons sold the San Clemente estate and relocated to New York, later settling in Park Ridge, New Jersey, to be closer to their daughters and grandchildren. Family, by every account from those final years, was where whatever warmth remained in Pat's life actually lived. Her daughters, particularly Julie, stayed close to her, and Julie would later write Pat Nixon, The Untold Story in 1986, the most detailed account of her mother's life that exists, filtered, understandably, through the eyes of a daughter who loved her. Chapter 8. What 53 years adds up to. Pat Nixon died at home in Park Ridge on June 22, 1993, of lung cancer, at 81 years old. Her husband, by all accounts of people who saw him in those final months, was devastated in a way that surprised even people who knew him well. He gave a eulogy at her funeral that he could barely finish. 10 months later, Richard Nixon died too. They are buried next to each other at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, the same region where a young lawyer once fell for a schoolteacher at a community theater audition and refused to take no for an answer. So which version was real? The wartime letters calling her the only thing worth looking forward to, or the quiet, sexless distance that people around them described in the later decades? The truth, based on everything biographers and staff and family have pieced together, is probably that both were real, at different points, and that 53 years is long enough for a marriage to hold multiple true things inside it at once. A devoted young couple separated by a war, a political partnership built on real mutual respect, where she was often sharper about people than he was. A slow erosion, campaign by campaign, staffer by staffer, secret by secret, until two people who had once written each other letters every single day could barely find anything left to say across the dinner table. Pat Nixon spent her entire life being underestimated. Underestimated as a farm kid from Nevada with no money and no family left. Underestimated as just a political wife standing behind a more famous man. Underestimated, even now, as Plastic Pat, a woman assumed to be hollow because she never let anyone watch her hurt. She wasn't hollow. She was disciplined, in a way that was forged by circumstances no 13-year-old should have had to face. And that same discipline is exactly what allowed her to stand next to Richard Nixon through 53 years, 2 lost elections, a presidency, a scandal that ended it, and a resignation broadcast to the entire world, without ever once letting the country see what any of it actually cost her. We only really know because the people closest to her finally started talking after she was gone. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're covering another one of these hidden political marriages next week. And if you want to go deeper on this one, Julie Nixon Eisenhower's book about her mother is the closest thing to a first-hand account that exists, and Will Swift's biography on the two of them as a couple is the best outside look. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.